maybe 15 years ago, that there was no documentation on film of what you had to do. And I paraded the idea around at various film schools, and they all nodded and moved on to something else. And then I got together in England with Howard Berry, who's head of post-production at the University of Hertfordshire. And I've known Howard for 10 or 15 years. And I pitched it to him, and he said, great idea, let's kickstart it. So we kickstarted the budget. It was in, I don't know, maybe 20,000, 30,000 pounds for the whole film. And we shot for 10 days. Taghi was one of the cameramen. We had 3 cameras. And we just, I and my assistant went through each of the steps with a microphone. We were wired up, and we were giving a kind of golf commentary on both the technical and some of the more artistic decisions of how did we used to do it in the old days. But in comparison, it's like the difference between driving a Lexus and
you go?
I don't have to. Yeah, I don't have to. And blacksmithing. I mean, at the end of each day, I hadn't edited on a moviola in 50 years, and so it all came back instantly. But at the end of every day, after 12 hours of banging away at this stuff, you just feel depleted.
Yeah, because I mean it's a physical. I mean you're standing, you're moving, you're.
Yeah.
You know, you're like the man
in a
behind the
certain
curtain.
sense, it's healthier because of all of that exercise.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's what I loved about the film is that I think everyone knows, at least in the abstract, oh, editing, I kind of understand wide shots, close-ups, or whatever. But here, watching your film, the documentary, you really get to see how the sausage is made. I mean, it's.
This is a book that I have written, which is in the last gestation stages before it gets born. It comes out in England in May, and in the United States in July 15th. Suddenly something clicked. The name, interestingly, comes from a newspaper article that the Russian writer Maxim Gorky wrote back when he was a young reporter in the town where he was born, Nizhny Novgorod, which is about 400 kilometers east of Moscow. And in 1896, the Lumiere brothers came to town with their show, and the only place in town that would accept them, these traveling people, was the local brothel, which was operated by a French-Algerian man, Charles Solomon. And they cleared out the central salon. They hung a bed sheet, if you could imagine that, at one end of the salon, and the Lumiere cinematograph at the other. And Maxim Gorky, who became a famous novelist, in fact, the town eventually was renamed after him. Now that communism is no longer in place, it's reverted to Nizhny. Anyway, he was sitting there with the great and the good of Nizhny Novgorod, and the not so great and not so good. And the projector lit up, and a street scene, the Place des Cordeliers at Lyon appeared. Just, carriages, pedestrians. And interestingly, Gorky immediately fell into what we would today call the uncanny valley. He was depressed by what he saw. Instead of thinking, wow, it's moving, he thought, it's moving, but there's no color and there's no sound. His mind immediately leapt forward to what it should be. And he was writing all this down about how bad he felt at looking at this stuff. It's a gray simulacrum of life, is what he felt. And then he wrote, suddenly something clicked, in Russian, of course. And what he had heard was the click of a splice going through the projector. And the shot of the Place des Cordeliers disappeared, and you went 400 kilometers to the south to the train arriving at the station, the famous shot. And he made the all the jokes about, look out, the train is going to come out of the screen and crush you. But it was the first time anyone, let alone somebody who was a great writer, commented on the cut from one shot to another. And he mentioned that in passing, and didn't make anything more of it. At the end of the article, he wondered, what is this medium? What is it going to be useful for? And he thought, pornography, violence, and domestic squabbles. So pretty accurate. If you did a survey of all films in release at the moment, a lot of them would be pornography, violence, and domestic squabbles.
But sound is really, I mean, it's half the experience, and a lot of times, a lot of filmmakers don't consider that.
Yeah, there's a phenomenon which doesn't yet have a name. We should probably figure out what the name is here today, which is if you have a film with, let's say, bad photography, but very good, clear sound, the audience will stick with it. If you have the reverse, they won't. You can have beautiful photography, but if the sound is and it's chaotic sound, the tolerance of the audience gives way and they will leave. So there's something about the way the human mind processes images and sound that complement each other. They're really the flip side of the coin of each other. And I've been privileged, and I'm almost the only person who does both in the Hollywood anyway, in the motion picture industry. So I edit the picture, and I'm thinking about the sound, and I'm sketching out the main forms of the sound as I do it, knowing that it's going to get much more detail later on. But that also means that in the construction of the image, I can let certain things go because I know that I can, in a sense, kick the ball to myself downfield because I'll solve that problem with sound when I get to it. And editors who don't know who is going to do the sound don't have that advantage.
You kind of buried the lead. You're the only person to win an Oscar, 2 Oscars for English Patient for editing and sound.
On the, yeah.
Yeah. So.
In England, it turned out I preceded myself because I did the same thing with the conversation at BAFTA. So I won the BAFTA award for editing and for sound on the conversation.
Yeah.
And that was back in 74.
Yeah. We have a lot of aspiring filmmakers, young filmmakers. Maybe talk about, you know, if they're directing, what would you like them to know about editing, and maybe make your job easier as an editor if you could talk to a director or any filmmakers?
I don't know. I mean, editing is so fundamental to, as I was talking earlier, to cinema. The paradox about editing is that it works, and objectively you think it shouldn't work. We could have experimented with editing in 1901. Well, hey, what would happen if we did this? And they would do it, and they would show it to an audience, and the audience gets seasick. They can't handle a moving image cutting to another moving image, because that's not apparently what happens in life. When you wake up in the morning, you take off the lens cap of sleep, and you are a roving camera for the next 16 hours with no, objectively anyway, no edits. And you don't leap outside yourself to look at 180 degrees suddenly flipping around. So the fact that it works is amazing. The reason it works is probably because film grammar obeys the grammar of dreams, pretty much. And you know, when we dream, we see ourselves in our dream. We've never seen ourselves in, other than in movies, we've never seen ourselves in a situation. And yet in dreams that happens and we don't think anything of it. where is that camera that sees me talking to somebody else? My own experience, and I'm sure this goes back millions of years in human experience, we never have had that experience. And yet there it is, and we accept it. So there was a little teething problem in the early days in Spain and in Africa and probably other countries. In Spain, there were explicadores. People were watching a movie for the first time. They had grown up never seeing a movie. They were in their 20s, let's say. And it was silent, it was a silent film, and so you had to have somebody standing on the side saying, this is what she's looking at, and now this is back to her, and now she's talking to him, you know. And so they were easing us into the grammar of film.
Yeah. So that, I don't know how far down the rabbit hole we want to get, but a little bit of what's in your book is that we need to be taught how to see movies and our brains need to get trained on how to see movies.
Yeah, you have to learn to dream consciously, I guess. And it's how, as a director, of course, you can use storyboards or objectively, or you can create virtual storyboards in your head, but you have to figure out how to dice up the reality that's in front of you. And Hitchcock, you can find stuff by Hitchcock who very much about this, and Cocteau, when he was directing Beauty and the Beast, the set, he said, it was like Vermeer sacked by vandals. So the set itself is chaotic, and if you're not used to that, it can overwhelm you. And Hitchcock says, I just see only what's going to be on the screen. So he had a mental filter in his head, and in the chaos of the set, he saw what there would finally be. But that meant that he had already diced up reality into these individual shots.
So do you think, the switch from analog to digital, do you think that changed our perception? Do you think that actually maybe, because there is a fundamental connection, as you lay out in the book, between the physical act of editing and the physiological, what's happening in our brain. So do you think there was a change when we went from film to digital?
As Chairman Mao said, it's too soon to tell.
Well, before we go too far, difference between documentary editing and narrative filmmaking, or narrative editing.
Yeah, the Coup 53 is an unscripted documentary. Particle Fever, the previous feature documentary I edited, was an unscripted feature documentary. And each film had upwards of 400 hours of material. Coup 53 was 532 hours. And you're in an environment as an editor where there's this unbelievable amount of material. And you're there with the director, and how are you going to forge this, blacksmith this material into something that has developmental coherence over a 2-hour period. I can get on a soapbox and say that any film editor who is working on an unscripted documentary should get co-writing credit on it. And I think that should happen. At a certain point downstream, both editing a fiction scripted feature and editing a documentary, unscripted documentary, they become more similar. You've got everything on the table. The film is roughly the length that it will be. You're always trying to make it shorter and better. You're still experimenting with structure and making tweaks here and there, but basically you're trying to make it as intelligible and as emotionally compelling as you can, whether it's a fiction film or a documentary. Do people know what's happening, and are they moved by that? down upstream from that, and the further upstream you go, the greater the differences are. Because in a scripted documentary, the only things that are going to be photographed are what's in the script. So you have a relative restricted amount of incident. There are 120 pages to the script, 36 sequences, and that's it, you know. But in a scripted documentary, in a scripted fiction film shot normally, you have a huge volume of interpretation. So here's a scene, and we're going to shoot 7 setups for that scene, 7 different camera positions, 7 different lenses, and with camera moves and other things. And for each setup, we're going to shoot anywhere from 2 to 12 to 20, who knows, takes. And so if it's a dialogue scene, each line of dialogue, do the math, you know, 12 times 7 is 90 something. So there are 92 different readings of that line from different angles with different spin on each line reading. So your job as an editor is to navigate those interpretations. If she says that with that lens, with that expression on her face, what's the best comeback from him out of his 90 different interpretations? And to make it all flow like it's organic and that it happened, but it's not. It's a Frankenstein monster of a thing that suddenly kicks into life at a certain point. Whereas in a documentary, it's the flip. You, in those 530 hours of material on Crew 53, there's an unbelievable number of incidents, scenes, that you could make. And yet, within each scene, there's only one thing. That door only opens once. That person says that line only once, because it's a live, unscripted documentary. You can't, as a director, you can't say, please do that again. You know, you're interrupting the reality of, anyway. So as an editor of unscripted documentary, you have an abundance of events, but a narrow, restricted amount of interpretation. And so you have to navigate that. And in fact, that Ray Fiennes yesterday said exactly that when he was talking about why did he choose the cameraman from Hurt Locker to be the cameraman on the Nureyev film. And that, I forget the guy's name, unfortunately, but he said, as a documentary cameraman, you only get that moment once, and you have to position the camera to take advantage of that moment, because it only happens once. So that's the you know, getting to that midpoint. With a scripted documentary, you are, scripted fiction, you are interpreting the work that's there, that you're turning words on a page into images and sound in time. But it's interpretive. It's not an exact analogy, but you're kind of the pianist interpreting, you know, should I come down hard on that chord? Should I soft pedal here, and how fast should I? You're doing those kind of decisions. Whereas in a unscripted documentary, you are creating the story out of this huge number of events.
I want to hear from some students or some young filmmakers. Any questions? Any? I see a bunch of students back there. Anybody?
Some people who can't stand it. You're in a dark room for 12 hours, 14 hours a day, hearing the same thing over and over again, and under a great deal of, or a moderate amount, sometimes a great deal amount of pressure and tension. And sometimes you break, you know, it's just, I can't stand it anymore. And if that happens, you go for a walk, go home, do something else. There's always lots of stuff to do. And editing is not just editing. It's data management, it's thinking about the soundtrack, it's going back to some previous scene and tweaking something that you had in the back of your mind. Sometimes jumping around in the film will relieve the pressure of that one thing. There's that line from Carl Jung where he says, sometimes the hands have an intelligence that the brain doesn't have. So just let your hands do the old thing about the yellow pages, let your fingers do the walking. Just start doing stuff without trying to analyze why you're doing it, and frequently something will pop up. Where did that come from? Well, it came from somewhere, but you're allowing it to happen. Too much conscious thinking about a problem can just exacerbate the problem. It's like scratching a wound.
Well, we just barely scratched the surface. We'll do.
Were you talking about production audio or sound design or music or all of the above? Or
Yeah, sound, production sound, which is dialogue, basically, is the spine of the soundtrack. You personally, you have to understand the dialogue. I don't agree with Christopher Nolan that dialogue is a sound effect. Basically, you don't have to understand what they're saying. Just feel the emotion of it. I don't believe that. Anyway, it's the spine that connects everything up, and that has to be protected because it's in its own little universe. Sound effects and music are spread out from that, and as I'm editing the film, I will pay attention to the clarity of the dialogue, and I will, sound effects that are important for story reasons, I will put in. I won't put in footsteps and that kind of stuff, but if they react to a sound, you have to have a sound, and it has to be an interesting sound. And it may be indicated by the screenplay, and it may not, but so I will add those sounds as early as possible because they're real characters in a sense.
when you were talking about fixing something later in the process, in the editing process, by addressing the sound,
Right.
were you thinking about the quality of the sound or adding sound design?
Yeah, adding sound. I mean, the classic example of what you saw here is the sound I added in The Godfather of the elevated train, which comes and goes during the scene in the restaurant. And then Clemenza had told Michael, you get the gun and come out blasting. But he doesn't. He comes out, it's a weird shot actually. He comes out of the bathroom and he stands there with a kind of weird, kind of nerdy expression. And so the audience, either consciously or unconsciously, is thinking, maybe he's not gonna, he's got the gun, but what's gonna happen?
Yeah.
So the heat suddenly goes up. And now he sits down and Sollozzo is talking to him in Italian with no subtitles. Very unusual decision that was made by Francis, which throws the audience into kind of a Christopher Nolan space. I don't understand what they're saying, but I hear the tonality, and it's a slow move in on Michael. And now what I'm doing is increasing the level of that roar and also adding a kind of Bernard Herrmann screech to it. And it gets louder and louder and louder, and then at the point that it can't get any louder, Michael suddenly stands up and shoots him, and the sound immediately cuts off, which means it wasn't a real sound. And there are people who screen the film and don't hear that sound. They interpret it as something that's going on inside Michael's head. The neurons rubbing against each other. Should I not? Can I not? Those kind of decisions. And he's in an impasse, and he breaks the impasse by actually shooting Sollozzo.
The other question, that you referred to editing the beginning of a film sometimes, and then not having scenes in the middle, working on the end. How often does that happen, that you start the editing process before? the
Always,
film? Wow.
yeah. It's the so-called American capitalist system. And it's also because of the corporate nature of the studios. They want as little time as possible between the end of shooting and the director seeing an assembled cut. And they want to have lots of different angles, because that means that the studio, if there's trouble, can reshape the film. When I was working for Fred Zinnemann, I noted, this is on the film Julia, Jane Fonda or Vanessa Redgrave would be walking through a doorway and he would say cut without letting them cross the threshold. And they had been instructed to stop when Fred said cut. And it was unnatural for them, and they kind of, like there was a bungee cord. So finally I screwed up my courage and went to talk to him, and I said, I don't understand why you won't let them go through, you know. And he said, well, why would I do that? Well, you know, I don't know, for pacing or something, maybe, you know. No, he said, I have it in my head how it should go together. And besides, if I let them do that, then she could recut my film. And I thought, who's that? And I said, who's that? Who's she? And his eyes, which were narrow anyway, got really narrow, and he said, Margaret Booth, who was Louis B. Mayer's henchman in post-production. And if a film was not working, Louis would say, Margaret, go. And the director and the editor of that film would go to work one morning, and the name on the door was Margaret Booth. And all of their stuff was in the hallway, and they were kicked out. So Fred grew up at MGM in the mid-1930s as a filmmaker, and he was terrified, as they all were, of Margaret Booth. And so he would do anything in the shooting to inhibit, kind of like one of those spiked bamboo things, you know, to inhibit any kind of interference from the studio.
Thank you so much for your time. We're way over time, but thank you for being generous.